So Simon Girty, wilderness warrior. Edward Butts. He wrote Simon Girty, a quest biography. Simon Girty, wilderness warrior. Edward Butts. Dundurn, Toronto. Chapter 1, War Drums. War Drums. It was the summer of 1756. And of course, 1756, was it 1754 to 1763? That's the French and Indian War. Been going on 2 years strong. Back in the summer of 1756, back in the day, in 1756, the summer of, 15-year-old Simon Girty was among the uneasy settlers crowded into the rough stockade called Fort Granville. Fort Granville on the Juniata River in western Pennsylvania. Simon Girty, 15-year-old, settlers, Fort Granville, western Pennsylvania, Juniata River. It was not a comfortable place in which to be confined. Dozens of men, women, and children had to spare living space in a relatively small enclosure surrounded by a log palisade. Accommodations were primitive. If you didn't have a place in one of the few cabins, you slept outdoors on the ground. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The privies stank in the summer heat and were thick with flies. The women and older girls divided their time between cooking, looking after the smaller children who whined from boredom. The men and the older boys, like Simon Girty, had their share of chores to do in the cramped fort, but they also had to take their turns going on patrols into the forest. 1756, it was different. Going on patrols into the forest and keeping watch at the walls. War had come to the Pennsylvania frontier. Some of Simon Girty's neighbors had already been killed or carried away as prisoners. Because their homestead was vulnerable to attack, Simon's family had fled to Fort Granville. With him were his mother, Mary Girty, brothers Thomas Girty, 18, James Girty, 12, George Girty, 10, half-brother John Turner, 18 months, year and a half, and stepfather John Turner, who was a sergeant in the local militia. As the teenage boy took his turn standing watch with the musket in his hands, the situation must have been as bewildering to him as it was frightening. The enemies out there in the forest were Delaware warriors, the Lenape people he had always known as friends. Simon Girty's father, Simon Sr., an Irish immigrant, had been a fur trader. He had gone into the business with a prominent merchant named Thomas McKee. Simon Sr. would load up a pack train of up to 20 horses with trade goods that the natives wanted: steel knives and hatchets, guns, gunpowder, and lead, flints, rum, cloth, blankets, colored beads, traps, silver jewelry, mirrors, and metal cooking pots. You know, that'd be fun today. Just have a traveling, a covered wagon that you just drive from house to house. The covered wagon, random goods. The random goods, he was literally a traveling general store. Exactly. A traveling general store. A traveling mechanic and general store. The natives paid for his merchandise with animal pelts, particularly deer skin. Simon Sr. had to travel the forest trails into the valleys of the Allegheny, Gahaney, and the Ohio rivers. I'm going to Guinea. He competed not only with other traders from the English colonies, but also with French Canadians who followed the river routes from New France in their canoes. It was a risky business because both the English and the French claimed the territory, and tribes sometimes switched their alliances. He dealt mainly with the Delawares, the Lenape, and earned their respect. His reputation as an honest trader spread to other tribes. When Simon Sr. married an English girl named Mary Newton and took up a homestead in Lancaster County, the place soon became a regular stopover for natives traveling between their home territories and the frontier settlements. Young Simon Girty, who was born November 14th, 1741, grew up accustomed to being in the company of natives. Simon Girty, they often came to the Girty house to visit his father, sometimes large delegations of natives On their way to treaty talks would break their journey at the Girty farm to buy some bread and milk. Simon Girty would wander among them fascinated. The native leaders wore their finest regalia, shirts embroidered with quill and beadwork, ornaments of shining silver decorated their bodies. The men wore breech cloths and deerskin leggings. Some warriors carried bows and had quivers full of arrows on their backs. Others had muskets, tomahawks, and knives were looped to their waist by thongs. The women wore calf-length dresses of deerskin or calico. Naked children would run laughing and shouting through the colorful throng. Simon wasn't afraid of these people, who often gave him and his brothers small gifts, nor was there any undue concern from his parents. While most of their white settler neighbors feared and hated the natives, the Girtys, however, did not. To most of the whites on the frontier, the natives were little more than dangerous beasts who had to be removed on the vast wilderness, could be opened to settlement and civilization. They made no distinctions between the various tribes. It didn't matter to those people if natives were Iroquois, Delaware, Lenape, or Shawnee. They were all savages. Traders like Simon Sr. were regarded by their fellow whites with a certain degree of suspicion because they traveled into mysterious and dangerous Indian country. Because the Girtys even welcomed natives at their home as guests, neighbors branded the family as Indian lovers. It was intended as an insult, but it did not bother Simon Girty. Disaster struck the family late in 1750 when Simon Sr. was killed in a fight with a man named Samuel Saunders, who was subsequently sent to prison for manslaughter. Mary Girty was now left with 4 boys to care for, ranging in age from 4 to 11, but like most pioneer families, the Girtys were hardy and independent. Simon, Thomas, and James helped their mother plow the fields and harvest the crops, while James played with little George so their mother could tend to chores. Thomas and Simon hunted for game. Simon already knew a few tricks of woodcraft that he had learned from native friends. Meanwhile, a farmer named John Turner took an interest in Mary Girty. He was hard-working, good-natured, and the Girty boys liked him. 3 years after the death of Simon Sr., Mary married John Turner. In February 1755, she gave birth to her 5th son, John Turner Jr. So 5 kids and mother and father. But the happiness of the Turner family was short-lived. War drums was pounding in the forest of the frontier. At the strategic point where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers converged to form the Ohio River, the French had built a new stronghold called Fort Duquesne. Right? Duquesne. Fort Duquesne. Why do I want to say Duquesne? There's no C in it. Or Q. Duquesne. Duquesne. Oh, man. Fort Duquesne. The British colony of Pennsylvania had just purchased a huge parcel of land from the Iroquois Six Nations Confederacy. As far as the British were concerned, Fort Duquesne was on their property. French and English interest in the territory had been on a collision course for a long time. Now the clash was about to come. In the summer of 1755, a British general, Edward Braddock, led a force of regular British troops and colonial militia against Fort Duquesne. Among his officers was a young George Washington, and one of his wagon drivers was a 21-year-old frontiersman named Daniel Boone. General Braddock was fresh from England and had no experience whatsoever at wilderness warfare. He refused to listen to the advice of his colonial officers. On July 9th, he led his army right into an ambush a few miles from Fort Duquesne. A few hundred French troops and Canadian militiamen and about 1,000 of their native allies literally cut the British army to pieces. Over 900 men, including General Braddock, were killed. Many British soldiers were taken prisoner and died at the torture stake. Washington and Boone were among those who escaped the slaughter. It now appeared to many of the tribes that the French were the superior power. Emboldened by the spectacular defeat of a British army and urged on by the French Delaware raiding, parties struck at the more isolated homesteads, killing, scalping, burning, and carrying off captives. Some of the raids took place near John Turner's farm. Turner joined the militia and helped build Fort Granville. In the spring of 1756, a series of deadly raids on outlying farms kept the region in a state of alarm. Turner decided to take his family to the safety of the fort. And you know, the 1750s, the roaring 1750s. Isn't that what the roaring 1750s? I think that's what they